Greetings, brothers and sisters. So this is, I believe, going to be an epic video because when I was waking up this morning, I was dreaming about doing the voiceover and I was recording it, and I was near some sort of a wall that was maybe like a dam or something, and these criminals were trying to blow it up. And I was trying to record, and my microphone was different. And I was like, why is everything so hard? Is this where I was wondering where I usually record. So if I was dreaming about it, maybe it's going to be more significant. But this is a video that's going to talk about the opioid crisis. And there's a couple of shows. I watched this movie called Crisis, which I want to talk about. That was about a month ago. And then my wife and I started watching The Crime of the Century, which is about, these opioids. And it gets really into it in a way that you normally don't see, a little bit deeper than the normal mainstream. It comes from, mainstream HBO and the Washington Post, but, it names big-time names, and it has parallels to the scientific agenda of today. But first I want to get into some predictive programming stuff that was in one old movie called Chain Reaction, and then some stuff from the comedy sitcom Brooklyn Nine-Nine. This is from a 1996 movie called Chain Reaction. So this is, 25 years ago, and right before the big event. And so what this movie's about is there is a scientist, sort of a brilliant, altruistic scientist, who wants to give free energy to the world. And therefore he was killed by the CIA. And Morgan Freeman, who's running the project, is sort of like a CIA handler. And Keanu Reeves, which is laughable, plays some brilliant, scientist mechanic. And this is the end of the movie where Morgan Freeman tells Keanu Reeves how it is.
Last thing I wanted was for something to happen to Alistair. But a decision had to be made.
So a decision having to be made was to kill him. He's a scientist, the brilliant scientist.
I'm paid to do dirty work. The work people don't want to know about. People want to live in their split-level homes and eat microwave dinners and watch color TV.
So he's talking about sheeple here. And there is a element of this in the truth community that I've talked about quite a bit. The society that you live in, there's things that have to be done that are bad, like unfair things, horrible things to good people of other countries, right? Just to keep your way of life. And this is also documented in the movie Margin Call. I've showed you some of those scenes where they're just telling you the way it is, right? And people don't want to hear it. Even people in the truth community, they want to live in this, altruistic idea of a utopian society if you just get rid of the bad people. But the reality of our economy, the reality of our way of life, the up-down, the haves and the have-nots, and a system that goes away from God, this is something I talk about quite consistently, goes against the laws of spirituality and nature, divine laws and natural order of things. Evil things have to be done to keep an evil system going.
Alistair was a dreamer. Clean air, free energy, noble concepts. But we live on a planet that is addicted to petroleum.
And the petrodollar, don't forget the petrodollar.
Now, what happens if you dump free energy onto the world market? Stock markets around the world would plummet. Our own economy would collapse overnight. Recession, unemployment.
So Keanu Reeves is shaking his head, but that's what would happen, right? And in the, Whispers of the Brighter World, there's, a prophecy about a clean, cheap energy that will be around, I believe, in about 50 years. And whatever's left of civilization will have to adopt it. We'll have to accept this free energy, this cheap energy, things like this that are being suppressed right now. because of the, profit that's being made from energy right now. The big energy companies are suppressing something that would be better, that would be cleaner. So all this talk about global warming or climate change is because of the corporations. There could be a clean energy. There could be a cheap energy, something that, the powers that be couldn't control, and they are going to suppress it, right? And, if they didn't do that, the economy the way it is now would collapse. And, this is being documented here in this movie.
Employment, war. The world is speeding up too fast now, Eddie.
Now, that's something Joe Biden just said, right? In a, recent multiple speeches. I just covered that in this other video.
I talked to Xi Jinping in China, who I know well. We don't agree on a lot of things. He's a bright and really tough guy. He truly believes that the 21st century will be determined by oligarchs, the argument is, because things are moving so rapidly, so rapidly, that you can't pull together a nation that is divided to get a consensus on acting quickly.
That the world is moving too fast, and that the oligarchs, the autocrats, are betting on democracy collapsing because decisions have to be made, and people aren't going to embrace those decisions. So it's the same rhetoric Joe Biden is now saying. The world is moving too fast.
We can barely hold on as it is.
You're right, it's not working. That's why we got to try something else. Not bury the technology, but let it out.
You let it out, but you let it out at a pace the world can absorb.
And so the other piece of this is Hollywood has a very complex relationship with the CIA. The CIA gives them scripts and information, and Hollywood makes lots of pro-spy, pro-CIA, CIA as hero movies. But also, once in a while, they tell the truth about the intelligence communities, or little bits and pieces where the CIA and the government is the villain suppressing. I mean, think about all the movies where there's some sort of conspiracy at the heart of it, and this is a movie with a conspiracy where there's free energy available, and instead of allowing that free energy to come out, the CIA murders the man who has it, takes the technology from him. This happens time and time again, to use for their own purposes, and suppress something that would actually be a good thing. And so this is, again, a movie in 1996 that documents this. So I got a couple of things from Brooklyn Nine-Nine, which is an interesting show for a couple of reasons. It's one of the better sitcoms. Like, sitcoms are flawed in their very nature, right? They're just, they're being written for jokes, right? So they have to warp reality to make jokes happen. But there are some funny jokes in this show. And what's interesting about this show is it's got a lot of liberal agenda in it. It's done in a subtle way, not in a forceful, over-the-top way. But this show started in 2013, and it covers this whole period of time where you can see, season by season, the liberal agenda that's being pushed, the Hollywood agenda that's being pushed in the nation, right, is then mirrored in this show. And I have a couple of clips of this here where there's like predictive programming, and they take a shot at Hunter Biden before Hunter Biden, right? So this is from 2016.
This is real important to me, all right?
Okay, I'm pointing out that he's holding up devil's horns just because if I don't, I'll get 37 comments. But he's throwing up the devil's horns holding the baseball.
My brother's hot wife is going to be there, and I haven't seen her since his funeral.
Wow.
Yeah, right? I mean, you only get one shot at your brother's widow.
Just go. Oh.
So you'd see the disgust on their faces because this is something that Hunter Biden did. Hunter Biden dated his brother's widow for, I believe, 3 years. And the relationship was whack, right? Because there was a point in time where she was worried he was going to kill himself when he was smoking crack, and she took his handgun and brought it to a trash can next to a supermarket across from a high school, an open trash can that didn't have a lid, and threw the gun on top. And the FBI and the Secret Service got involved, and it later created an investigation, which was, along with the whole laptop thing that happened later. But the timing of this thing is also very interesting. So this is from season 3, episode 2, which would be 32, right? For those of you who are keeping score at home, which is a Freemasonic number, in an episode called The Funeral, and it's from 2015 to 2016. So when Hunter Biden started to date his brother's widow, Haley, it was in 2016. The relationship ended in 2019. So it's interesting that this was something that was said here, right? Because they make it very clear that this is unacceptable behavior. And back then, in 2016, Hillary Clinton was running for president and everybody wanted her, all these liberals in the mainstream media, and they didn't want Joe Biden to run because, he was Joe Biden, and they thought Hillary was the better whatever. She's unlikable. She has all of her downfall, all of her faults, but they were pushing Joe Biden not to run. And this show is doing a hit piece on Hunter Biden. I mean, I can't imagine they weren't conscious of Hunter Biden dating his brother's widow. Like they just randomly said it. It seemed like it was intentional. They really made a point to show how disgusting that was. And I documented this before. David Letterman and other late night comedians, Jon Stewart, did a whole hit piece on Joe Biden, The Audacity of Grope, based on Obama's Audacity of Hope. And then CNN covered Joe Biden as a liar, a groper, a gaffe maker, all to deter him, saying this is the stuff we're going to be playing if you try to run against Hillary. So they made it clear they wanted Hillary, even though Joe Biden was the vice president and Obama didn't even endorse him over Hillary. Hillary was his Secretary of State, And so Joe Biden, this clear message was sent out there that all these things are out there, all these things that you have that are negatives, we're going to bring up if you try to run against Hillary. And so Joe Biden didn't even try to run. The message was received. And I have to believe that this was part of the message because they knew, right? They had to know that Hunter Biden was banging his dead brother's, widow, right? So this is the only person that's famous we know. Like this is a joke that doesn't seem like a coincidence, right? Sometimes they make jokes that are, they're shots at people, and that's what this seems like it is. And then there's this other piece that has to do with COVID and predictive programming. There's a recurring character who has is having some sort of short-term memory loss, and he was getting tattoos to tell him what to do. A la, was the movie Memento, which was about a character that didn't have any long-term memory. And so he tattooed things all over his body so he would remember what to do, right? And so that's actually referenced in this TV show. And then there's this.
Okay, this one says, buy toilet paper in a truly gigantic font. I hate to think of the horrific event that led to a reminder of this size.
This is from season 7, episode 3. And its air date was on February 2020. So that meant it was probably filmed in the fall sometime or the summer of 2019, right? And the toilet paper crisis started on April 19th when Corona was just getting bad. You remember when, there was just a run on toilet paper. And so this episode, which, is clearly predictive programming, is talking about a toilet paper crisis and wondering what happened to make people buy all that toilet paper just a few months before it happened. So in February, the episode was released. And then in April, so you had February, March, April, right? So basically 2 months later, there was the toilet paper crisis. And so we see this time and time again, right? Where there's predictive programming, where things that are in movies and TV shows it would either have to be some divine intervention where people writing and making these TV shows and movies have some insight into what's going to happen, which is completely possible and maybe probable at some point, or they know ahead of time what's going to happen and they're divulging it, right? I mean, there's only two explanations because it happens so much. It's like far beyond a coincidence. And so when TV shows and movies put these things out, and again, it's either proof of some sort of divine system where these things are being, put out there to warn people, or it's a part of a controlling system. And you can have your opinion, what it is, which one it is, but it's, impossible to prove with the information that we have unless somebody came through and said, yeah, we had this information, or we were told to put this in the TV show, unless somebody, and then, how do they document that, right? But in terms of that, we see it. Like, it's just right there that this guy is saying a couple months before the toilet crisis, I hate to think about the event that made the apocalyptic event that made everybody buy toilet paper, right? It's going to make everybody buy toilet paper. And so if you understand this, TV show and movies have some, even if they're fictional, have been proven over and over again to document what's going on in the world, right? So I want to draw parallels here between this predictive programming, and it's been established. I mean, this is just, a little, snippet of all the times that Hollywood has been involved with the agenda, whether it be predictive programming, whether it be, sending messages out there. My wife and I just watched this movie, and it was not a good movie. I'm not recommending it. It's something like something under the Silver Lake, right? And it is sort of a Hitchcockian Rear Window type of a movie where this character, the guy, the second Spider-Man guy, the guy who played the second Spider-Man in movies, is like this girl disappears, and he has this theory that all these things that are in pop culture and music and TV shows and movies is a secret way to communicate among the so-called elite. And you think it would be better than it is. I mean, there's lots of revelations, and they get into the whole owl thing. And so, we know that there is a link between Hollywood and letting some of these, some of the agenda out, right? That these fictional movies aren't fictional. There is truth in them. And there's subliminal messaging. There is, symbolism, all these things. We know all this, right? Most people understand this. And right now we're being told that science is honorable, that medicine and science are honorable, and there's no, flaw in them in terms of the, science is science, and when something's scientific, it's a fact, and that science can't be manipulated. But I've talked about this so much, right, in terms of scientific fraud, where scientists who are human beings are pressured into lying because of whatever it is, right? They're pressured into delivering false results, false scientific results because of money or whatever might be going on. It happens all the time. And it's documented in this movie Crisis, which is a fictional movie that has truth in it about the opioid epidemic, and in this HBO Washington Post documentary, which is mainstream as it gets, right? Washington Post, mainstream media. And they're documenting how science and medicine lied, and the government, the FDA, and the legislative body of the Congress lied and manipulated and changed the rules and laws to basically have hundreds of thousands of people lie, and then all the other things that were people's lives were ruined, and then the economic costs of the opioid epidemic, right? All these things have been documented. And so that has a link to what's going on now. I've said this a lot, even in terms of the heartfulness meditation. Like I said, when people used to ask me what I thought, like a good description of the heartfulness meditation was, I used to say, it's as perfect as anything could be that have human beings in it, right? Because there's always human flaw. There's always ways that human beings will wreck something. And science in its purest form, and even the allopathic medicine in its purest form, could be great, right? Could be wonderful. Anything that's in its purest form with human beings not manipulating it, not lying about it, not using it for their own personal gain could be great. But, human beings are involved in all these systems, especially now during the Kali Yuga. And so let's get into it, because you can see here, and I documented this also with the tobacco industry and the way that the tobacco industry paid all of these doctors and scientists to give them favorable results. And you also see the same thing with Monsanto. I'll come back to that as well. But let's talk about the movie Crisis first, and then we'll go to the crime of the century. So in the movie Crisis, it was a time when Armie Hammer was being accused of all kinds of abusive and weird stuff. So they released the movie during 2020, and Armie Hammer was being, he was one of the characters, he was one of the actors in the movie. And so there's basically 3 storylines. It's one of those movies. There's a movie called Traffic that was similar to this, and then Women, Men, and Children, which is about the internet. Traffic was about drugs, and Men, Women, and Children, that was the name of that movie, was about the negative effects, especially to do with sexuality and the internet. And these movies are similar because they're all really depressing. There's no happy ending. And it documenting something that really happened and is really happening. And it has separate storylines. It's really multiple movies within a movie. And so Armie Hammer plays an undercover DEA agent that's working with, the Canadian Mounties to bust there's going to be multiple spoiler alerts here, to bust a pill ring, right? To bust a opiate ring for a new fictional pharmaceutical drug that's being marketed the same way that they marketed oxycodone, OxyContin, all the stuff that is covered in the crime of the century. Gary Oldman plays a sort of a broken down doctor, scientist who works for a university who does research for the drug company. Evangeline Lilly plays a ex-drug addict who has a son who's like a star hockey player that died of an overdose, and she knows that it's, foul play, it's skullduggery. I got a chance. I always like to get skullduggery in there. And she's, sort of going rogue and wants to, find out who murdered him. Only at the end of the movie does Evangeline Lilly and Armie Hammer interact. And Gary Oldman's storyline is separate. But Evangeline Lilly, this is how I knew about the movie, because I saw something on the New York Post or whatever, page 6, that she praised Gary Oldman in Instagram, but didn't say anything about Armie Hammer because he was going through this controversy, right? And so the movie just didn't take off. And I think it was also shelved because it had implications to demonizing the scientific community and the medical community and showing you that there's scientific fraud and medical fraud. And so the storyline with Gary Oldman is he's doing these experiments on mice, and there's this new drug coming out that is supposed to be a non-addictive form of an opiate pill like oxycodone or OxyContin or whatever it is. And he's run a bunch of tests, and they all are showing that the mice aren't becoming addictive. But one of his lab assistants, instead of having the test done for 7 days, has it done for 10 days, whatever it was. Extends the test for an extra time period, and all the mice die, right? And so it looked good when they did it for a limited time, right? And this is something that was based in a real event. And so when Monsanto was testing their GMO corn that had a pesticide built right into it, which, is a nightmare, a pesticide that kills bugs, and we share much of our, biology with insects, they fused it right into their GMO corn. And they had these tests on rats that they ran for 3 months, and the rats were fine. And they only experimented on it was 10 rats or 11 rats or 9 rats. I mean, a real small scientific sample. And so a French scientist repeated the same test, but instead of doing it for 3 months, he did it for 6 months, and the rats all got tumors. And then he was attacked because Monsanto has all kinds of money, and by the scientific community. They were like, why did you use so few rats? And he said, I just repeated your test, right? But still the test was demonized. This has happened over and over in the scientific community. And he was attacked there. He was attacked by other scientists who were Monsanto shills and agencies. And Monsanto's, death corn is still out there being grown all over the place, right? And so this is stuff that happens. And so this fictional, the so-called fictional doctor in this crisis movie doesn't really want to report the results, but his lab assistant says, we got to do this. People are going to die and get addicted. And so he reports it, and then his university pressures him to change his findings. And then the drug company offers him $700,000 to change his findings. And then he gets all these things. He gets fired and ostracized and demonized, and they bring up, his past and all these things. And, they write all these stories. The news media gets involved and is hammering the guy. And this is what happens, right? This is what happens to scientists that go against the corporate and government will. And I know this because I've researched events that have happened like this. There's a guy out there, and he did a study for atrazine for his university, like University of California. He was an African-American guy with sort of dreadlocks, and he wore these hippie clothes, and he clearly was a liberal. And he found that atrazine, you can look this up on Democracy Now! It's on YouTube. And atrazine is a chemical that Americans spray in grass. It's a pesticide or an herbicide or something. And Americans use it, but it's been banned in European countries, in all of them, right? Because it's, toxic. And it has an effect like it was turning frogs, male frogs to female frogs, and turning frogs gay and things like this. This is what this guy said in his findings. You can find the interview on Democracy Now! On YouTube. And so, he was fired by his university, and he had thugs threaten him and things like this because he didn't deliver the findings. Whoever the company that owns atrazine hired the university to give them favorable results, right? They're giving lots of money to the University of California. And so, they wanted the results that they wanted. And when he didn't deliver, they turned on him, right? And he was, ostracized, all these things. This happens all the time in the scientific community. It's happening in this fictional movie, and it's happened in real life. And so, a month later, my wife and I started to watch this thing last night. We watched almost the whole thing. It's probably about 30 minutes left. It's 4 hours, and it's done by HBO and the Washington Post, which are, very mainstream, and I'll talk about that later. So they're certainly not truthers, and they're talking about the opioid epidemic being the crime of the century. And we know what's happened here, right? We know, the crisis, the hundreds of thousands of deaths, the money that's been spent. And there's some points there's some of the narrative I just wanted to go over here if you haven't seen it, because it's interesting, because of the names and the players that are involved. So it's the Sackler family that's a billionaire family, and there was 3 brothers. They all became doctors, immigrants from Eastern Europe, and they worked in a psychiatric institution, which they electroshocked people, and they had a aversion to it, but they did it anyway. Electroshock is unbelievable, just barbaric. And again, I have a master's in counseling, and I worked in these treatment centers, and these kids were all on medications and things. And so they came up with a way to deal with pain. And it's an interesting, point. There's a doctor in there that talked about how old school doctors in the 1800s, 1900s, they thought pain was a part of it, that pain created the, onus for healing in the body, which is true to some extent, that pain creates a situation where your mind and your body focus on that area and send healing, whatever biological healing down to the place where the pain is, right? Pain lets your body know that there's something wrong. But at some point, it became this, and it was because of these Sackler brothers and their, company, Purdue Pharma, that they were, pushing this idea that pain was a horrible thing. This is something that we have in American life, that pain is unnecessary and that you shouldn't have pain, that pain is something that should be avoided, and, pain is somehow evil. And they've marketed that into something where they came up with a opiate in the form of OxyContin and oxycodone and these, drugs that they have. And they said it wasn't addictive, even though it's like on the same level as heroin and, morphine and things. They said it wasn't addictive or was less addictive, and it could alleviate people's pain. And, it was like criminal for doctors not to give their patients a relief from their pain, because all these suffering people, and they cared so much about these suffering people. And really, they are drug dealers who, the weakness that is in biological humans, but as well as rats and mice and these things, or rodents, or what they experiment on, that will, they will ring the bell over and over again to get their drug and become addicted and die, right? Programmed in our DNA is a binge mechanism, that when we find fat or sugar, or, it could be sex as well, that it clicks in. There's a part of the mammalian model in the brains of all these species, that there's a binge mechanism that clicks in and say you have to, when you find something that's rare in nature, that's essential, you get this reward system for eating fat and sugar, right? So that's the way that the powers that be have marketed cheap fat and cheap sugar that don't exist in nature. Like most fruit in its natural form is pretty sour. And so you don't find many things that are really sweet in nature. And fat, we have these, animal farms where the cows and the pigs and the chickens are all fattened up, and, but in nature, most animals are very gamey, very lean, right? And so fat and sugar don't exist in nature, but also in terms of the sex mechanism. You can see that there's a good TED Talk by that guy, Gary Wilson, about the great porn experiment that talks about, pornography being along these lines and how it's addictive. And so we have that in our system, and animals have that in their system. And so other human beings are exploiting this weakness, this tendency towards pleasure and addiction, which, people have a connection to. And so people would start taking OxyContin, oxycodone, and then they would become addicted, and then, the prices would, just like with every other drug dealer. And so this Purdue Pharma made billions of dollars and turned this into $1 billion pain industry. And there's a number of key players here, and I hope I remember them all, right? But one of them was Johnson & Johnson. And so we know about, and I talked about this in Afghanistan where they grow poppies, and there has been, there is in terms of the timeline of the opioid crisis, is when the Taliban were removed from Afghanistan, where poppies grow really well. Poppies are the flowers that produce opium. And so the Taliban that were ruling the country at the time stopped all opium production. But then when we invaded Afghanistan and took it over, the opium production rose, right? And I talked about that in other videos. And opium is worth so much. But Johnson & Johnson in Tasmania, right, by Australia, this small, island area, found a way to genetically modify, talking about Monsanto, the poppies so they produced more potent opium, and they paid and bribed farmers to grow these poppies. This is Johnson & Johnson that's, they're involved in things going on right now, and this is a criminal organization that decided to grow opium and get the exclusive rights to sell opium in the pill form in America. And Johnson & Johnson and Purdue Pharma hooked up. And so, these are multi-billion-dollar corporations that lobbied and got politicians and doctors and scientists on their side, to push this opium. I've covered this a long time ago, but there was the East Indian Company that came out of Britain that stole all the gold in India, and just a horrible, they were like the Rothschilds of India. A British company that went into India like the Rothschilds ran their banking industry. Very manipulative, and, they messed up India. I mean, how India got messed up by the British. But then they wanted to take over China, and they shipped all kinds of opiates and cannonballs, and, they did all these sort of merchant way of smuggling in opium. And the Chinese military, and there was such a crisis, it's what messed up China today. Like, China was so negatively affected by their being addicted on opium, and they were taken over, and, all these things that happened. You can look this up. The Chinese are still upset about this and don't trust the West because of what they did to them. This could be something they're involved in now as some sort of, revenge thing that's happening now in the opium crisis in America. And so you understand there's historical understanding of what opium does, right? Opium and heroin, all these things have been around, and we know how people get addicted to them, and we know what happens to them and their families, and we know what happens to the economy and the peoples when there's an opium crisis. So this isn't like we don't know, right? This isn't like, this is the first time we're experimenting with something like this. Everybody who's involved with this knows historically what opium does to people. And so they push this idea, this model, that there's so much pain in the world, and this opium could help them safely if it was managed properly by these doctors. And they used this as they got doctors on board to push these drugs. And there was a salesman that's in the part two of there's a two-part documentary. And he talked about how there was 4 types of doctors. And there was only one type, the 4th type, that he said he spent any time or energy. And these were the businessmen that didn't want to hear about their patients. They didn't want to hear about the drug and how safe it was. They wanted to hear about, how does this benefit me? And what they would do is pay them exorbitant speaking prices. They would pay them to lecture on the drugs, and they would give them cars and, hookers and all these things. In fact, this guy hired an ex-stripper who was, running the sales team on this one fentanyl. There's people selling fentanyl, right? And, they bought all these doctors and the pill mills. So we know there's people in the medical community, this has been, documented, that would just set up these pill mills and become drug dealers. This is there's another documentary about this pharmacist who lost his son to heroin, and he saw this happening in Louisiana, and he, started to lobby and fight for the closing of these pill mills, where these doctors were just handing out scripts to anybody who came in. They were pain management places, and they were just basically drug dealers. Not basically, they were drug dealers, right? And so they started to suffer publicity setbacks, right? And they documented various doctors who went to Washington, D.C., and were working with the DEA and things like this. And they had ways of closing that down. Like, there was a guy, and all these guys are really ghoulish. The Sackler family and all these doctors they interview. There's this guy who lost his wife, and he took all these pictures of his wife, like, sleeping in laundry baskets. It's brutal stuff. And she got off of the opioids, but she went back to this doctor after she went through rehab, and he was very demanding and, said that she needed to take these things. And they came up with this term, pseudo-addiction, right? And so those were people who were in so much pain that they were demonstrating the same symptoms as someone as an addict. There's no science behind this. Again, this false science. But they got all these doctors and these people, these talking points. They hire all these lawyers and professional marketers, and all of them, are embracing this evil and ruining people's lives, killing people, right? These, they're working for legal drug use pushers. And so they came up with this term pseudo addiction. And so it was, it looked like real addiction, but it was because people are in so much pain and they were desperate to have more pain medication. So they said that the way to cure the pseudo addiction was to give them more oxycodone, right? To give them higher doses. I mean, it's just completely evil. And they hired Rudy Giuliani, who, being America's mayor, and he shilled for them, like he did with Trump, just being evil and lying and just being, another ghoul. I mean, totally ghoulish, creepy MFer. And they bought all these politicians, and they bought an FDA, some people that work for the FDA who signed off on a lot of these theories. They bought and sold all these people. And many of them, after they left the government, like they had a Clinton lawyer who was the next person below Janet Reno in terms of being the attorney general, the most powerful law enforcement person. And then she became a private lawyer who was hired by Johnson & Johnson and Purdue Pharma. And so these people who used to have, be on the law side of things, and some of these politicians then went into the private sector and worked for these, these drug pushers, right? And they document all this stuff. And it's something that, is, I guess, well known now. And so they had this doctor from West Virginia and some of this DEA agent and all these people talking about this one guy who used to be a lawyer for the DEA, and then he went to work for these big pharma companies, and he knew how the DEA stopped them on a manufacturing level and on a distribution level, and he created a new law that was backed by all these various senators and congresspeople. And he, this law denuded the DEA. There's a time where Chris Dodd was, and that scumbag Chris Dodd that I knew from Connecticut, just a slimy MFer, right? And, you can see it in the documentary. And he attacks the addicts. He said that it's not the drug, but the addicts that are the problem. And, of course, this wasn't people who were addicted. Many of the people who got addicted to OxyContin and oxycodone and all these things were addicted because they suffered some sort of pain, right? And they had pain management, and they became addicted from taking the pills. They weren't addicts beforehand that were, they immediately tried to snort it. They were people who were in pain and then became addicted, right? There's so many documented cases. And so to blame them when the FDA got, bought and sold, I mean, the FDA, all this stuff, right, with science, like how science is thrown in our face constantly right now. Oh, science, you got to trust the science. Well, what about the science behind the opioid addiction? What about the science behind cigarettes? What about the science behind Monsanto? Like so many things where science has been compromised and scientists have been compromised, we see it over and over again. And the medical community was documented as being compromised, and a lot of bad doctors who were selfish and greedy sold themselves out and gave prescriptions to people, getting them addicted to this medication. And so they had this lawyer that used to work for the DEA and that was now shilling for big pharma, and he got this law passed that undermined the DEA's ability to fight all these things. And so there was this DEA agent who was testifying in front of Congress, and there was this woman from Tennessee who was bought and sold by Big Pharma and some other people. All of them were getting donations, and they're hammering this guy. They're grilling this guy in a way you could tell that they were bought and sold. And underneath the congressmen and women who are grilling him, they show how much money they receive from Big Pharma. And this one woman received almost $1 million in donations. And plus a lot of these people will go work for them when they retire from politics and go to work for the private sector. And so all of these people were so corrupt, and they made it sound like the Congress people were just ignorant. Like this was the Washington Post and HBO's take on it, that these people are just ignorant, the politicians, but clearly they knew, right? Like this is where it doesn't go far enough into truther land. all these people were evil, and they know what was happening. They, were getting all this complaints, and, people, these families that were coming there, and right, their constituents, and they just sold themselves out and were making it easier for these drug companies to operate. And all these big institutions, Johnson & Johnson's, all these, big drug companies that got involved with this all knew it was going to happen. They know it was happening. And they changed the laws. They changed the rules so they could get away with it. They got backed by the FDA, and they just threw money at, everybody in power, and they all backed it, right? Same thing happened with cigarettes. Same thing happened, with so many different things, Monsanto. And they just pushed through things that were bad for people, that negatively affected people, and made them legal, and even made it sound like they were good things, that they were helping people, the pain management. And you see these ghouls. I mean, they're just ghouls one after another. These ghouly MNFers, all of them, who are just like dead inside. They have this one Sackler, the guy who's running the company, and then this doctor in Utah who had this pain management. He had 100 of his clients died, right, who were looking for pain management, who became addicts and things. And just, completely evil, right, going over the dark side. And yet we're supposed to trust the religion of science. And I've talked about how religions get compromised. I've talked about how people see a way that a religion can be used as a powerful force to make people behave, to give them money, to do whatever, right? So many ways that religions are evil and do evil things. And science is now the most powerful religion in the same way. Because it's not true science. It's not science without profit. It's not science without influence. It's not science without corrupt people and governments and corporations getting the results that they want, because, that would be fine. That would be good science. That would be factual science. Still limited because it leaves out God and the etheric worlds and the causal aspect, the soul, the causal bodies, all these things I've talked about. But it would still be great, if it was pure, but it's not pure. And so when they push things on you, this is the science, and they say, science can be trusted. Well, science can be trusted, but MNF and people can't, right? Like, I trust scientists, but I don't trust people. Like, I've seen it over and over again. Like, I've seen people just, disappoint and take the easy path, and, everybody fights with this in their own human nature. And I've seen it time and time again. And what I do here, what I did as a counselor in my personal life, even within the heartfulness meditation, I see people who, maybe they rise up at some times in their life. They go to the higher level and they, behave like saints. They behave, like good people. They embrace their higher nature. And I see people do that. I've met great people in this world. But more often than not, people will make the wrong choices, self-sabotage, and make bad choices for themselves and other people. It's human nature at this point. We have a human problem, and to deny that, it's everywhere, right? Or to say it's just these guys or just those guys. And so there's a scene that, they talked about how this was an Obama problem, and Trump vowed to, when he was running for president against Hillary, he said he was going to clean up the opiate addiction because Hillary was a part of it. But then Trump hired one of these scumbags, like one of the scumbags that was featured, in the documentary, one of the worst people Trump hired as the guy to deal with it. Like, you see this time and time again. They put a criminal in charge of administering the laws and rules of these criminal organizations. And Trump did that over and over again. Like, there's all these people that were Trumpers and talking about how Trump was going to, clean up this stuff to do with Jeffrey Epstein and things like this. But then Trump appointed one of the lawyers, the original lawyer, the original district attorney, the Costa, I think it's Andrew Costa, or one of those Costa guys. He appointed him a high-level position in the government, and he was the guy that made the original deal with Epstein to give him, basically no prison time, because Trump is a part of it. All these powerful and rich people are part of it. They, work together, and they all have dirt and secrets on each other. It's in their best interest to support each other in their criminal activity. Like criminals who go after other criminals wreck the whole criminal enterprise. And so they have to support each other. These are criminals in government, criminals in big business, criminal in science, criminals in the medical community, and they make a fortune. In fact, I told my brother I was watching this, and he said, yeah, he'd already seen it. And then he said he just watched, I guess it was another documentary. He couldn't remember the name of it. And he said that it was about, there was these brokers that went out and found drug addicts, and they pay the drug addicts $2,000 to go into treatment because Obama had a program, a treatment program. This was another way. Now, these treatment programs are cashing in on the epidemic. And then he'd go to the treatment program and say, I have an addict for you. How much would you give me for a referral? And they give him $8,000. So he would take $6,000, give $2,000 to the addict. The addict would go through treatment and then go back to the streets, and the guy would hire him again to go into treatment. It was a way of exploiting the system. And you see on every level, this is human nature. People say, well, people are going to take drugs anyway. They always have these rationalizations and excuses for doing what they did, right? For doing evil. And they come up with these talking points, and they make the other side crazy. They got this DEA agent fired, right? This guy who's being interviewed in this documentary. Congress got him fired. They were taking all this money. They were taking millions of dollars. And he said, if you pass this, he said something, and they said he was harassing them, right? And they put in someone in his place that was completely compromised. And so this is how, you can see the structure of a criminal organization that touches all of these powerful aspects of our lives and how they're bought and sold, and there's no justice. And then they want us to trust them. And there's something wrong with us, like I said in my video last night, if we don't trust them, right? When we've seen what they've just done, it's still going on now, right? With fentanyl and all these things. We've seen how they've hurt people and lied for their own profit. And now they went, well, that was so last week, but we're great now. You can trust us. And if you don't trust us, there's something wrong with you. One thing that I know that other people that present information in the truth community don't seem to know, or either they want to present false hope or whatever it is, right? And it's evident in this documentary and just watching this. And that is the system itself, the system we're 100% dependent on, runs on evil, abuse, and exploitation of nature, of other people, of, consciousness, right? Of our spiritual nature. It deprives us of understanding the nature of our soul and our true purpose here. I talk about that with the heartfulness meditation all the time. And you see it in this documentary where you have these people, these doctors and these relatives of loved ones who have died because of the opioid crisis. And everything is on their side. The facts are on their side. History of opiates is on their side. And the government, which is supposed to be there for them, and these DEA agents and all these, law enforcement people, the good ones, right? And they do all this work, right? They get this information out there. They bring it to the powers that be. And the powers that be shut them down and maybe even punish them. First, they might try to bribe them, the government, the corporations themselves, right? The drug companies, they had this one drug rep who saw some of these things going down where he saw people snorting OxyContin, and he went to the doctors, and then he saw one of the doctors wiping his nose when he came to the office because he was an addict. And he went to the drug company and saying, this is what's happening, and they just, shut him down, right? Because the powers that be know something, and all these people who have influence over it, because not all these, corporations or people are necessarily greedy, evil bastards, right? But they know what Morgan Freeman said in the beginning of this thing, that the system runs on evil, an evil that we don't want to know about. The normal person doesn't want to know about. In fact, I'd rather forget about these things. The people who are living well in suburbs, the people, in Western countries or in poor countries that live well, don't want to know about all the suffering it takes for them to have the lifestyle that they have. And our system is predicated on hiding the pain and abuse and the slavery and all these things. Historically, in every possible way, hiding the evil and, letting you know that the system can't deliver to you the lifestyle that you are addicted to without evil, right? Without some of this, the ways that they make profit. And that the whole system has that, buried the pain and suffering it causes to nature and to other human beings and all of it, consciousness, all the things I said earlier. They hide all that stuff, and most people don't want to see it. And if you saw it, you could take down the power structure, but then the system would go down with it. And most people don't want to face that, right? And I see it over and over again. I see it in the truth community, how people want to come up with some BS solution and figure out a way to make this system good and divine. And, and it can't. It's not that kind of a system. The debt-based economy, the power system, all of it, right? Just the way that people are, focused on themselves and their entitlements and all these things is a big part of the problem. It's the part of the problem we all contribute to because we don't want to give up our lifestyle. I don't want to give it up. Like, I don't want to give up, all the things that I'm accustomed to, especially as I get older. Nobody does, right? And, people turn a blind eye to the evil nature of the system because the system is taking care of them until something bad happens to them. And then they're like, wait a minute, this isn't fair, right? Well, the whole system isn't fair. You're just on the upside of it. And most of the people listening to this, you're on the higher end of the system, like most of us are. Most of us are in the good side of the ledger, right, where people want to be, on the wealth side, especially people in America. Even homeless people in America are doing better than in other countries. And so in America is one of the places that's blessed by the, evil system. And so when when you get in touch with the evil, one of your, relatives die from, one of your kids dies from being an addict or any of these things, and you're like, wait a minute, then you go to the powers that be and they're like, get out of here, slave, right? And you don't understand why it's happening. It's happening for this very reason, because the system feeds off of evil. And only when the system collapses will this end, right? And when it collapses, then we don't have the system that we're 100% dependent on. This is the, paradox that most people struggle with. And it would send us back to the dark ages. I mean, to caveman days. And so, with very little skills and people being weaker and weaker, especially the younger generation, each generation getting weaker, and not the ability to, live without the system, right? That, not the strength and the capacity to go and, redo what we used to become, what we used to be in terms of living in agrarian and tribal situations and getting along with people and working together as a community and sacrificing for each other. Those things don't exist inside most people. Like, they're buried there. The potential's there, and the potential to connect to God, what I say with the heartfulness meditation. I mean, there's a solution out there, but most people don't want it. So there has to be things that happen, negative things, and the system collapsing to get people to embrace their inner divinity and their higher qualities and their inner strength. I mean, so many people are just assed out and bankrupt inside. They don't have enough in their tank to fight the evil, right? They're just trying to get by, and they're so weakened by the system, right? And so, there's certain things that have to happen, and everything just has to bounce right, because you send everyone back to the caveman days where people are just, foraging for, picking through trash cans to get some sustenance, right? And so, they don't have enough time to rise up to a higher level of consciousness. So there's this brief window where the system's collapsing on one level, right? And, we need what the system gives us in terms of free time and, a lack of labor, a lack of primary labor, that we can use that time and energy to become better people. It's this small window where people have to start to see what's happening and get motivated and, change and create a new, better system and create the momentum for humanity to go in the right direction. At the same time, before the system collapses and time runs out on our ability to have free time and energy to devote to such things as spiritual growth. That's the heartfulness problem, right? That there has to be enough, of the support of the system where people have the ability to put some time and effort into connecting to God internally and cleaning out their, spiritual grossness and things, that the heartfulness system helps them. And also having the motivation of the system collapsing to get them going to do that before the system collapses completely. And then they're like, well, I've just got to survive, right? I don't have time to think about God, right? People are starving and weak and, sickly and all these things, living in a post-apocalyptic situation. And so, happy days. Only spirituality will save this world. It's Barabato, definitely reporting from the Apocalaughs and the Ascension. Everyone have a blessed day and be grateful.